Greetings and welcome back. I am again today joined by our eminent resident geneticist, Hayden Kelladon. We will be talking again about a genetics-related topic, specifically the topic of aging. And I realize many moons ago I had a brief discussion about it with the deceased Adam Jensen. We're going to be reviewing some of the basics and then maybe go into the details of why it's so problematic in terms of trying to stop it and reverse it and what have you. And with that said, I will get right to the topic. So, if we wanted a broad description of what aging is, Tayden, and I asked the question, Tayden, what is aging? How would you describe that?
I would say aging is generally a combination of either a programmed cessation to cellular division under natural means, or the accumulation of damage such that the continued replication of those cells is impeded. And the normal
Sounds like a good definition.
Yeah, I'm just trying, because aging can be a lot of things, but I think it's generally to do with the stopping of cells regularly functioning within an organism, usually multicellular, because we don't really think of this happening in single-celled organisms as much, or in simpler organisms. Organisms that aren't programmed to die will generally find a way to die on their own. Like the damage or the other parts of the definition I brought in will kind of be their substitute for aging. So aging is like the naturalistic process that happens to any living being as it continues to exist. Or in more sophisticated multicellular forms of cooperative life, you might see it increasingly become programmed, or the result of their continued cooperation with different types of specialized cells.
Which I think that line of argument or description probably fits best with just mammals, specifically because mammals are, in many ways, the most complex life form on the planet, say compared to I don't know, some type of starfish, say.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing. Program. There's something almost fatalistic to that. Everyone can observe it. You're born, and then you grow up and you age, and eventually you die. And there's that phrase, to die of natural causes, which basically is synonymous in some sense, even though people never knew that, with maybe having reached the Hayflick limit, as an example, or your body no longer being able to, as you pointed out, repair the damage. I mean, so if you look at the whole discipline of geriatrics, for example, which is quite interesting, I would argue aging in some sense is a type of disease, or all the things involved, but my parents are senior citizens, and they have all kinds of minor problems they didn't have previously. Well, why? Well, inability, the cell's inability to repair themselves, at least as efficiently as they used to.
So to the argument that it's a disease, I would say that as much as it is debilitating and a decrease in status, say, from where you were and where you are, it is, on the other hand, a cure to many things. So if you didn't have multicellular life that was cooperating in such a way that some of the cells would be weaned off of the ability to proliferate, then you would have them proliferating at the expense of the overall organism's survival. And that can be cancer, that could be any number of things, but the correct functioning of your entire body might depend on this type of regulation. And then, over time, as damage accumulates and the chance of cancer goes up, the inability of cells to procreate past a Hayflick limit, or whatever type of self-imposed limit there is beneficial, because nothing lives forever, really. There's no cell that is forever rejuvenated. It's division, really, which renews that information, and it is by multiplying and rolling the dice so many times that things remain static over time. So as much as it's debilitating to the individual, it's what prolongs them to experience those debilitating effects.
We're kind of throwing around the term Hayflick limit. Maybe you'd like to explain to the audience what that is, and in case they're not familiar.
I think the Hayflick limit is just so normal cells under laboratory conditions. We observed sometime when we started looking at cells in the 60s that around 50 divisions is what you could expect from your typical sample. So if you so if you observe human cells in culture, that is to say taken from the body, put into conditions where you might breed other kinds of cells, and observe them dividing, you'll only get around 50 divisions before they peter out and die.
Right. And the consequence, of course, for aging in this case is renewing the body and staying relatively youthful is all dependent on your cell's ability to divide themselves. And if you reach that limit, well, you won't be able to rejuvenate as much.
Right. But again, being eternally rejuvenated isn't probably the best possible outcome for the genes involved in making all of these things happen in the first place. If you were eternally rejuvenated, then there's an increased chance that eternally rejuvenating cells would become more and more capable cancer cells. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, and that's an excellent point. There seems to be a host of mechanisms in the body that we were just talking about before. The way we should probably introduce all these terms. The p53 gene and telomeres interact with each other in order to prevent cancer. So there seemed to that's the thing. It's and this is about increasingly as I learned more and more about aging. My hopes were dashed, not for myself necessarily, but for the species. But also that a lot of these things just seem to be these ideas and dreams are built on castles made of sand, in the sense that the things you're pointing out, which are very pertinent, the idea that, let's say just for the sake of argument, we could remove caps on telomeres, right? And say you remove the Hayflick limit, and then basically you have infinite division. If you did nothing else, then there probably would be 100% probability that eventually you would develop some form of cancer.
Well, it's not just that. So we think of cancer maybe as a monolith, when cancer is really just the escaping of cells from. They kind of exist naturally and in what we would call a healthy state, in a cooperation with the other cells. But individually, the cells that are cooperating are made up of only what would have made them proliferate to begin with. So you're taking a bunch of things that only know how to divide themselves and putting as many controls on that as possible so that they can work together and limit that process and do only what would help the whole system divide and reproduce. So when you think of it all as cancer, I think you're getting it wrong, because the cooperation depends not only upon the non-development of cancer, but the continued specialty of each cell, which requires a different level of, for example, like the composition of the hepatocytes in the liver have a different number of mitochondria, and the division of those cells into daughter cells may be problematic if it were to happen as quickly as they would like, or as quickly as we might like, for example, to consume more things that poison our blood. So the correct functioning of specialized tissues, is what I'm trying to say, is infringed upon by the ability of cells to infinitely proliferate.
Yeah, and it also seems to be, again, a kind of a lack of knowledge. Because, I mean, this is something human beings do all the time, that we just don't have... If we understood every single function in the body down to a T, maybe we could somehow circumvent some of these issues. But it seems unlikely that, assuming we were ever do that, get rid of cell division limits and things of that nature, that we could take into account every possible consequence and every, as you pointed out, mitochondria in the liver, different from any place else in the body, that we could take into account all of these factors and then somehow make it work. Why then do you think people, we're kind of skipping to the chase here, but so many people are so helpful. People like Audrey what's his name? Audrey de Fleur de Bur, the biologist whose entire life goal is to sort of stop aging.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has TED Talks, he's got his blog, and he's convinced that it can be done. If not reverse it, then just stop it. I think is some of the things he said.
Because who would want to listen to a TED Talk from a biologist saying things age? Most of the things I have observed age, and their reasons for doing it make sense ultimately in an evolutionary frame. But you and me were doomed. Nobody wants to pay for that, watch that, or think about it. I don't. It's not a valuable commercial idea.
Tane black pill Kaladin. Yeah, well, that's I could definitely see that angle. I've to be fair, I don't want to get on a tangent, but I have seen some more somber TED Talks on occasion, sort of the kind that make you reflect on things and what have you. But yeah, I'd agree that that's not a popular thing. But he seems genuinely convinced of it. But maybe it's important to talk about some of the processes involved in the whole aging process. So there's apoptosis, there's autophagy. We already talked about the Hayflick limit. There's telomerase, which is an enzyme, the telomere. So maybe let's just start with the sort of alphabetically almost. So let's talk about apoptosis. So maybe you could explain to the audience what apoptosis is, how it works, and its function.
So apoptosis is something that you'll learn a lot about if you are studying cancer. And what it is programmed cell death. Every single cell in your body, and in multicellular eukaryotes generally, will be equipped in such a way that if things aren't functioning right, and certain heuristic measures of that are presented on the cell's surface or even within the cell itself, they have a mechanism, almost like I've heard it described as like a doomsday cascade, whereby they will destroy themselves if these irregularities present. And the purpose of that is that ultimately these cells existing in cooperation can only do so if they're made to fall in line. If a cell is presenting irregularities and it isn't equipped with a self-destruction mechanism, then there's nothing that other cells can conveniently do to get to that cell or to cut it off from resources. It needs to be within the cell itself, the capacity to kill itself, to enforce the cooperation.
Yeah, that was a good summary. And specifically with respects to aging, why is apoptosis so important?
Apoptosis would be important because aging might be kind of an extension of that process, because as things become damaged and irregular, apoptosis becomes more and more likely of an outcome. So if you see cells that are dividing less and becoming more and more dysfunctional with increasing exposure to the environment, damage that can't be repaired. There are types of damage, by the way, that can be repaired perfectly within the environment, but there are types caused by, like, for example, X-rays or UV radiation that cause double-stranded breaks that don't have a proper fix outside of like a structural one. So whatever was struck will be lost in terms of its original code, but that it can be joined again is enough, usually, for the cell to keep on dividing. And if it's not, signs of DNA damage promote things like apoptosis.
Yeah. And there's another, speaking of the A's, there's autophagy. That's why autophagy, the audience might have heard this term. It's, it's kind of a fad thing almost, because people will talk about fasting or intermittent fasting. And yeah, there's definitely evidence that if you fast for a certain period of time, it promotes autophagy. And it's kind of incorrectly claimed that as a consequence, autophagy by itself and some other things are going to basically increase your longevity. I should point out here that we don't have the evidence for autophagy and its relationship. I should also explain what autophagy is. It's basically the regulated self-destruction of a cell. Literally is from the Greeks to eat or devour oneself. And it's basically a process of degradation and recycling, and it's touted as something healthy, and the body needs to do it. And I know that it's attested by fasting that that's what happens. But it's a bit of a tangent. But this idea that the mouse metabolism. I mean, it's a mammal, of course, but there's the age limit on mice, how they metabolize, all these other factors. In the research, it's been shown that prolonged caloric deficit and or fasting in mice promotes greater longevity. That doesn't necessarily mean it would happen to human beings. I just get that out of the way.
I think that has to do generally with metabolic rate. So the heart rates and processing speed generally of these smaller mammals increases in inverse proportion with their size.
Yeah. And
they'll generally be shorter lived the smaller they are, and they'll experience things faster than we do.
Yeah, and proportionally greater. I mean, for example, I don't know off the top of my head what the lifespan of a common house mouse would be. So I'll work with 2 years off the top of my head. It could be, I think it might only be one. But
I'll go with you there because I'm not 100% sure myself.
I'm not a zoologist and I'm not a specialist in rodents, but that's 2 years. If let's say you put these mice in the lab on a regime of 25% fewer calories than they're supposed to be consuming, and or a type of fasting, and they end up living 3.5 years. They don't live a long time in the first place, so that seems really significant. Not necessarily something that you can transfer to human beings. There's also no way, I would argue, really, to run a long-term controlled experiment on human beings to do that. You would probably literally need a century to figure that out, to see with a control group that, over multiple generations of scientists saying, okay, you guys, you're in your early 20s. We're going to start you on this, and we're going to keep on checking in with you every decade or so, and there'll be a new team of scientists. And when you're 80, we're going to, it's just... So
and there's so many variables. What we consider a life worth living, you have to consider how divorced that is from the state of nature.
Yeah.
So a life worth living to us is going out to eat how many times a week, putting what in our mouths, breathing what type of air, interacting with exotic materials that you keep on your person at all times, sleeping in strange arrangements of fabric, breathing in the dust that came off the body of hundreds of people. It's a very strange environment.
Raising your blood pressure, playing shit games like Overwatch with shitty teammates, and
don't tell me about it. I just got off of a binge session with Overwatch, and
dude,
I'm really...
I did that one. I don't want to go on tangent, but yeah. But it's a great example of how divorced we are from nature. Letting a bunch of pixels get to the point. I'll just say briefly that before I retired from that game, I'm not exactly young, I had chest pains for an entire night as a consequence. So, yeah, we're really divorced from that state of... Yeah, I'm not even kidding. I literally had premonitions of getting a heart attack. But yeah, we're really divorced from that environment, and I just don't see how we could really run that experiment well. Primate experiments seem a bit more promising to see if that sort of thing would work. But the simplest issue is, even if it were the case that long-term caloric deficits and or fasting were a surefire way to, I don't know, add 20%, 25% to your overall longevity, who's going to really have the willpower to constantly do that? especially a constant caloric deficit. You can't physiologically do that forever. Eventually, you're going to run out of gas. Fasting, provided it doesn't go below maintenance, it's possible, but it's just very, very, very difficult to achieve. But autophagy also, I should point out, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, autophagy, as far as I know, also has health benefits. I mean, for example, the autophagy that takes place in white blood cells from my understanding, renews the immune system and can theoretically strengthen it. That might not lead directly to living longer, but you'll have a better immune system for it. So there are benefits to it. It's just people are kind of selling these things as, oh well, you'll live longer or whatever. And there's no way to test that. And again, you would need.
It all depends on what you're going to be exposed to. Your immune system will still weaken if you have memory cells. Your secondary response, and I'm not an expert, but I know a little bit about these things. It's not a guarantee that you'll live longer. It's basically insurance against the exact same thing happening to you again. It won't be as severe.
Yeah.
But a weakened immune system will still fall prey to the same attack.
Yeah. So I think there's so much misinformation out there, and also kind of overly hopeful information about all the things that we can do to promote our health and stave off aging and what have you.
Well, have you seen the large... there's been a large series, actually, from major YouTube channels devoted to a Russian research institute, animations, videos, streams, and then most recently an adaptation of a children's story written by... I'm not sure if it's the same person as who was giving the TED Talks, but a story where aging was likened to a dragon. I think it's like a half an hour long video uploaded by these same people, CPG Grey. And there's a German gentleman who does animations that are very popular on YouTube, always on the top of trending, talking about research that they've done in mice, which has reversed some of the processes of aging, and how this Russian millionaire has got this institute that's going to halt human aging within our lifetimes.
Yeah,
it's all very...
a lot of overreach.
It's very popular.
Well, it's understandable. I mean, anyone who you're not in your prime anymore, I mean, you'll notice it, and the older you get, the more you notice it. So it's not fun. Aging is not fun. Decline is not fun. But it seems to be pretty much an inevitability. Obviously, there's a difference, say, being your 40s, 50s, and 60s in today's, in the current years, people like to say, compared to 500 years ago. In fact, it's quite possible you wouldn't even be alive. You wouldn't hit 50 500 years ago, even not very probable. So you can still have a decent life, all things considered, because of modern medicine, technology, comfort, hygiene, etc. But the things that we've been talking about, the fact that there's a programmed aspect into cell death, basically, and inability to repair things. Well, that's part of it. Telomerase and telomeres, we should cover those as well.
Sure. So chromosomes are capped with a certain region of DNA, unlike the previous regions of DNA, in that they are strictly functional. So you can think of other parts of DNA as being random, sometimes containing genes, sometimes not, and inherited as such. But telomerase is a protein which would add additional hexamer repeats to the end of chromosomes, which are split off because of the looping structure at the end of them, called like a cap, and they need to be pulled apart for each division. The number of these hexamer repeats that you have is a hard limit to the number of times that these chromosomes will naturally divide without exposure to additional telomerase.
Yeah, and there's a decent amount of variation between people. I have seen some evidence to suggest that children who are born to, say, teenage pregnancies tend to have shorter telomeres than people who are born in you could say, a more normative range of age for parents, interestingly enough. Which may or may not tell us something. But yeah,
I think it's interesting. I don't know what it would tell me, though.
Yeah, I've been trying to, here's, I mean, we're kind of all over the map here, but that's fine. It's an interesting discussion. When I looked at some of the stuff related to that, my first thought that I had was that maybe we're, it's more to do with, if you everything has a potential genetic component as well as a environmental component. If you come from some of these people in the UK, these chavs who are grandparents in their late 20s, etc., that there's a repetitive pattern, and so maybe it's less to do with the age per se. So if you had parents that had their children in their late 20s, and all of a sudden, whatever, the child makes a mistake, maybe it's a female gets pregnant at 13 or 14, maybe it wouldn't be the case. Maybe that it's actually part of the genotype of these people, and because to have shorter telomeres, and it seems to be related to the younger age, but arguably it's a sort of repetitive genetic cycle that these are the types of people that are genotypically and then environmentally propelled to have children at a younger age rather than the young age per se. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So you're saying if these people come equipped naturally, the people being born with shorter telomeres, they're given a lower natural lifespan and a shorter time frame in which to have children themselves, which propagates the lower amount of telomerase.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's a self-repeating cycle.
Pretty much.
It's interesting. I haven't seen the study personally.
I'm just theory crafting here.
Yeah.
So I don't really obviously know. But yeah. And again, a lot of people invest a lot of energy in telomeres and telomerase, and they think that, if we just can figure out how to reverse some of these processes, then we can reverse aging or what have you.
Well, once you have these cells starting to tear apart their chromosomes, it doesn't take long for major damage to set in. It would, arguably, if you could induce telomerase in each of your cells that you'd like to reverse the process of aging in, you could and would likely see a resurgence of youthful features, but the cost would be the expression of damaged materials. So things that probably are dead for a reason or as a class would be considered undesirable for their expression nowadays as opposed to their state as once was. It is, it's not going to be entirely sunshine and rainbows. The feature that the telomerase is serving here might have best been like a one-time deal.
Yeah. I mean, there's for example, I mean, this is somewhat related. Wealthy people these days tend to use a lot of somatotropin, human growth hormone, as a kind of anti-aging agent. And definitely, we know for a fact that human growth hormone and somatotropin, it's highly anabolic. It accelerates protein synthesis in the body. It promotes lipolysis. And even to the point, there's evidence that you don't even need to be in a caloric deficit. You can do maintenance, and provided you have a decent diet and you're on human growth hormone, it will shred the fat off of you.
Right. So lipolysis being the process by which the lipid cells in your body break down energy and then send it back throughout to the muscles and other demanding tissues.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. And so, it seems great on paper. And the problem with HGH is that it also promotes IGF-1, insulin growth-like factor, and we know for a fact that it's insulin growth-like factor presence of that at high levels, at least in other mammalian organisms, seems to shorten your lifespan. So it's a good example of something that's a bit of a double-edged sword, rather than this this cure-all, for example. And the same thing is things like synthetic testosterone. which people, I mean, that's a much safer thing than HGH, I think, overall, but there are problems with that too. Your LDL, for example, tends to go up, and other things. And I think the lesson I would take from all of these kind of, whether it's a external agent, something exogenous that you're applying, or these theoretical considerations of using telomerase as some kind of miracle cure for aging, it seems that everything comes at a cost, and we might never have the full knowledge of all the potential costs that could come with some kind of cure for aging, or really for anything, I think. I don't know if you agree.
I'd agree that there's always going to be a cost, but that we'll never develop any kind of aging technologies that work for a generalized purpose, I don't think is correct either.
Okay.
We'll probably find longevity-enhancing products, and with their use, processes and technologies that will counteract their side effects. So, say if you were to rejuvenate the body as a whole, and we were to increase our ability to fight cancer such that you could have an additional 1 or 2 bouts with it before you kick the bucket, then it might be worth it to apply the ability, like, to have the treatment where aging is reversed within your body if you're able to take the cancer that comes with. It might be a worthwhile trade depending on the number of years that you can negotiate from that type of process.
Yeah, I actually agree with it. I think based on what I've looked at, a kind of retardation would be reasonable. So maybe you can slap on 10 to 15 years of extra youth onto somebody, maybe something like that. But this grandiose idea of living for centuries, I think that's something that is just, as long as we remain mammalian flesh bags, not going to happen.
Right. At the end of the day, there is original genetic material that is fragile within its environment. The only reason anything on Earth remains as it is, where one thing is like another, is not because it stays, but because it replicates. And by replication, and replication itself isn't perfect, and that's how we have evolution, but by replication you can have more of a thing, and then diffuse the chance of it being destroyed. So immortality, I think, in general, as it's borne out here on Earth, isn't a possibility through anything other than replication against the cold hard fact that everything is destroyed over time.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get all physicky, but it seems to go against entropy as well.
Right.
I mean, if we could achieve functional immortality, I'm sure some physicists can. I am not a physicist by any means, quite the opposite. But it seems to suggest that you could effectively counter entropy, which would be...
Well, I don't know if you'd be countering entropy. It's just that you're putting energy.
Well, you're dumping it off elsewhere, basically. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But the problem, but again, there's always in a body, for example, there's limited spaces where you can dump the bad stuff, right? So again, you'd run out of space to dump things in, from the negative effects. I mean, there are certain species of tortoises that can live well past 2 centuries, but even they seem to eventually kick the bucket. Maybe best case scenario, we could shoot to live for another century. I don't know, but again, they have they're reptiles. They have a different physiology. I'm not really sure.
Reptiles aren't. So one of the key features of mammals and species that generally, mammals, birds, we do something what's called besides our environment to keep ourselves at a normal functioning rate. So the temperature remains the same.
We're warm. We're warm-blooded.
Right. We generate heat as a process of our metabolic functioning.
Thermogenesis.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And as a result of this, we're able to maintain a certain rate of being, and other organisms aren't necessarily as picky or as industrious as this. They don't necessarily demand the same temperatures that we do for their internal functioning. They may have a range of proteins. That's one of the strategies to deal with this, like a range of functional variants that have to do with, this is common in plants, and also animals that live in a variety of different temperature conditions do more or less the same functional processes, but in different temperatures. So we don't have that. We typically have an optimal range of functioning with very few exceptions, and everything needs to be maintained at that. And it keeps the overall metabolic rate up and shortens our lives.
Basically, you're saying that a homeotherm has the very state of being a homeotherm, which is basically what Tim was describing, an animal that has to self-regulate its own temperature. Mm-hmm. That being a homeotherm in itself imposes limitations on you as far as longevity is concerned, whereas what's the term again? Poikilotherm, I think. Poikilotherm.
Tolerant,
is more tolerant and is affected by the environment. Take like some sort of lizard that's basking in the sun and then going back and forth. The other thing I just realized that we hadn't talked about is, human beings by definition are pretty big brain nibbas, and there are things like brain plaque, and the brain. How would you the brain over time naturally decays basically in terms of its functionality. That's something that a tortoise, very small brain by way of comparison, doesn't have to deal with. There's so many factors, it seems, that go into maintaining an optimal state in mammals and specifically in human beings that it just doesn't seem plausible. My deceased friend used to always look to reptiles in particular, poikilotherms, as a kind of model in which to base things, because they don't have many of them have much longer lifespans, like tortoises and what have you.
Right. Well, they seem to be living life kind of on their own terms, only living as much as they want to. But I don't think it's as glamorous as all that, because part of being a mammal and being as big-brained as we are is being a huge metabolic engine that's always revving, and it only has the only place it has to go is up, and that's kind of what it means to be an intelligent ape. Yeah. Like everything we know and value about ourselves is tied with this idea of like a constantly functioning metabolism, something that can't just be shut down at a moment's notice as need be.
Yeah, and a brain that consumes, I believe, off the top of my head, at least 20% of the energy that the entire body requires. That's a lot, because considering how small the organ is compared to the rest of your body. This is not an issue that a toad or a tortoise has. These are, by way of comparison, it's quite. It's kind of an apples and oranges thing. But I see people constantly thinking. There's also some, I don't remember the name of it, some species of clam and or oyster. Don't quote me on it. I don't remember which one it is. It lives someplace in the North Atlantic, and it can live well past 3 centuries or something at the bottom of an ocean.
Well, a lot of something I like to say is a lot of these organisms, especially ones that are ocean-dwelling, haven't really learned, if you'll excuse the use of the word learned, as a substitution for an evolutionary adaptation. They haven't learned to kill themselves yet. So they don't require such a degree of cooperation within multicellularity that they would want certain tissues to stop dividing or to stop or to have basically breaks built in. They don't need it yet. They'll find their death within their environment before they have need of producing death within themselves.
Right, and I think, and that's kind of the whole point, that the greater the complexity, the greater the necessity, it seems, of having a kind of baked-in programming to die.
Right. And this actually, that has to do also with the development of like a complex body.
Yeah.
So oftentimes when you create something that has parts and intricate workings, the process that is involved in creating it is an expansion and then a contraction of programmed cell death. So, like webbing between your fingers, which dies off, stuff like that. Like what bridges you together and gets things where it needs to be originally has to die for things like a complicated body to develop in the womb.
Yeah. Yeah. And let's be honest, clams or oysters, they haven't gotten much done apart from just, I guess, living a long time and on occasion reproducing.
Right.
So
it's not very enviable.
No. I guess it would really depend on your perspective, but as you pointed out, the things that...
You referring to General Chief?
No, I wasn't. That one came out of the blue. No, I haven't seen him in ages. But no, it was more that for most human beings, the things that we value typically, they're not comparable with the things that a clam or an oyster values, or a tortoise for that matter. I don't think... Let's say, just as a thought experiment, because I love thought experiments, we could potentiate the upper limit on aging to somewhere with a tortoise, like, I don't know, 2 centuries, maybe 250 years. But the trade-off would have to be that you basically live more or less like a tortoise. I mean, for some strange reason, this bizarre thought experiment, you have all the qualities you have as a human being, your metabolism, your neural function, etc., but you basically have to live as a tortoise. Would people really want to live 250 years as a tortoise, or the equivalent life of a tortoise as a human being?
What would be the functional consequences of living, as you say, as a tortoise? Are we like just taking those however many times like the multiplier is on our lifespan, and then dividing all of the speed of the processes involved by that?
Yeah, and basically the whole point of it is you're just existing. But yeah, well, I don't think most people would want that. At least that's my impression.
Well, what if everyone were to do it all at once? Then it would be normal, right?
If you could normalize tortoise behavior, yeah, but then human society and civilization would cease to function, basically, because...
Well, you could say that the time frame in which we experience reality is arbitrary anyway.
Maybe.
That we all experience things in common, and so we don't think it's weird that, other organisms perceive the world way faster than we do. We don't really give much pause.
Well, yeah, but what I'm thinking is that I guess this has been a common theme in this discussion, but maybe the fact that we have achieved a fair bit and done, whether it's erecting skyscrapers or creating computer code or decrypting the human genome, whatever it might be, all of that is the end product of a complex system that can... And what I'm arguing is that all these end products, I would argue probabilistically at least, can only come about as a consequence of a complex system, the complex system that we are, and it's conditional on the specifics that make us the complex system that we are, and that deviations from the totality that makes us that complex system would probably make us render us incapable of doing the things that we manage to do, is what I'm arguing. Yeah.
Then that also raises an interesting counterpoint, which is, would we find it desirable to live faster lives with increased capabilities?
Yeah, well, that's I don't mean to bring up video game lore, but the Solarians from Mass Effect.
Right.
Do you, I don't know. So the Solarians...
I'm aware of the Solarians.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It might be before your time, but before BioWare ruined everything. Yeah, the Solarians are this sort of... They're basically humanoid amphibians that have a very short lifespan of 30 or 40 years, but they're faster on their toes. They can think more quickly. They're more agile mentally. They have all these mental capacities that other species lack, but they just die.
Very sparse verbiage.
Yeah, they die earlier than others. Yeah, I'm not really sure. This is the thing. I think at the end of the day, I think functionally and practically and pragmatically, if human beings were forced to choose, human beings, they value functionality over, say, just duration. So what if you could live to be 100, but you start just falling apart after age 60? What's the point? But what if, for example, instead of living to 100, you had almost perfect functionality, almost equatable to, say, between age 25 and 30 after that, all the way up to your 60, at which point then you just sort of drop dead? I probably would choose the shorter life option, because decline isn't fun. It's not really enjoyable. It makes you less capable of doing the things that make life, quote unquote, worth living, whatever that means.
Right. But I think something that may be missing from that Mass Effect anecdote is the consideration for how an organism perceives its own lifetime.
Yeah.
Humans may find that their life is desirable as it is because it is as it is. And you might find that Solarians, living only 35 years or thereabouts, find the exact same fulfillment and the exact same amount of proportion of their life as a degradation as humans would. Things might, for the all things being equal, feel the same.
Well, I think it's interesting. Your argument is in a sense, we're all trapped within our own looking glass. And this reminds me of, for all the Dungeons and Dragons geeks out there, the sort of snotty, snobbish way that elves in that sort of lore universe look down on humans as these sort of scurrying little things, because elves typically live many centuries, sometimes even 1,000 years, and so they have time to sort of chill out. And human beings are always in a rush because, well, they barely live a century if they're lucky.
Right.
But it's the human being can't have any other perspective other than we can only have a human perspective. It's not as if we can assume a tortoise's perspective or an elf's perspective or a Solarian perspective, or for that matter an Asaric perspective, in which they live well past 1,000 in many cases. Same with Krogan. We're kind of again trapped in our own looking glass, and so the optimal, obviously, for human beings would be something that I think, based on the discussion we've had, is largely unachievable. A kind of high functioning relative youthfulness that is just extended beyond what we conventionally can achieve. So, your endocrine system starts to fall apart after age 25, albeit slowly at first. But so let's say, you could up it to 50 or something, just as an example, one element in your body. Yeah, people would like that, but we are kind of limited by our own strange perspective. On the other hand, I would offer a semi-counter argument to that the very notion of health itself over time has changed quite a bit, just because, for example, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, if you got to 40, you were one lucky mofo in many ways, for all sorts of reasons. And, being 40, or especially being sort of 50, would be, ancient by those standards. And so there are kind of changes in the standards of what we consider to be healthy and reasonable.
I would argue that that's not really a change in our biology so much as a forcible removal of things which would kill our weakened bodies.
Oh, I totally agree. And you could even argue that it's a bit dysgenic, what we've done. I mean, in fact, you would have you'd have to be lying to say that, in the strictest Darwinian sense, many of us, quote unquote, should not be here. If we're going to only use a Darwinian heuristic of how to run the world.
Well, Darwin never really said that the environment can't be what you make of it.
No. I know. I'm not saying that Darwin was prescribing anything. It's just that everyone who has myopia, needs glasses, for example.
Right.
In
And
a
we tolerate that genetically these days.
Right, in a hunter-gatherer society, that, or having, being short-sighted or whatever it might be, would be a disadvantage, and in more than theory, that probably would be bred out. But over successive millennia and centuries, we've created technologies, some of them minor, some of them major, that allow people that otherwise would not survive to survive. I would even argue that the phenotype that we tend to regard as eugenic is of a fairly different sort than the type that existed, say, 60, 50,000 years ago.
It's sort of like a vanity reflection.
Yeah. It's kind of, I sometimes call it, we've moved from the club to the keyboard. And the thing is, these days, the people who, well, it's complicated because those who are ruled by the club are still reproducing because of policies that are in place, you could say. But without going into too many details there, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about when I talk about the difference between those who use the club and those who use the keyboard. Obviously, 50,000 years ago, those would be the most, you could say, genetically fit individuals. They would produce the most offspring. It was a physical environment. We've moved away from that, and I think that in the strictest Darwinian sense, not in a prescriptive sense that Charles Darwin said X, but a lot of us shouldn't be here, including myself probably, because I have flat feet. As just an example, it seems minor, but if I walk for more than 2 hours, even with inlays, I get incredible pain, and it gets to get blisters. And how would that work in a hunter-gatherer society? I wouldn't be able to participate because the basis of every prehistoric human society before the advent of agriculture was something called persistence hunting, which involved long runs after prey, weakened
prey animals into geographic features which would allow them to be successiously harvested.
Exactly. And an individual such as myself with flat feet that after only 2 hours gets incredible pain and then blisters of it, I wouldn't be able to participate, and I would be therefore useless in that context, and therefore would not reproduce. I'd just probably die, or maybe the tribe would cast me out or kill me or something because I'd be a liability. The
Earth is no stranger to mass extinctions. The accumulation of variations such as flat feet doesn't necessarily have to be dysgenic, so long as there is a viable population from which to select traits.
Yeah, I'm just giving an example, a theoretical example of how something seemingly minor in the right context could be either dysgenic or would not lead to genetic fitness. So,
right.
Yeah. The same thing could be said for, well, it's interesting. We all know these people who can eat 8,000 calories a day and don't gain any weight.
Christ.
I mean, they do exist. They're rare, but they exist. There's no way on Earth that they could live in a hunter-gatherer society and survive with that type of metabolism. In an evolutionary sense, the efficient metabolism is the metabolism that is quote-unquote slower, the one that stores the energy, puts on the fat. That's what's going to make you survive longer. These individuals, these kind of burn-through-everything individuals survive because they have supermarkets everywhere, and they have all the comfort. There are tons of examples you could give of things that wouldn't exist in a more primitive, or you could say traits that wouldn't exist in a more primitive environment. But we think, for better or worse, we think it's okay that they exist. I don't really have a strong view one way or another on this. I mean, we live in the world we live in. Had I not existed, I wouldn't even know. So, but there are definitely things that these days would not have existed in a previous age, I think.
Yeah. And I think you could argue that maybe things like aging or the the way our biology spins out and betrays us as we age could be propped up by modern amenities and the increasing amount of treatments for rare genetic disorders. It might eventually build into a situation in which aging becomes more of a problem rather than less of one.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, I think there's another aspect here that I think is interesting. It's kind of more of a ethical consideration than it is a scientific one. But do you know the content producer Philip DeFranco?
I do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't follow him. He's kind of a normie guy, mainstream guy, but I forgot what the disease is called, but he has some kidney disease that isn't terminal but is long-term painful and dysfunctional. And he cited some high probability that his son would have it, and it just seems this is the type of thing that these days even people with, I guess, potentially severe genetic diseases have no qualms about just, I'll just pass it on to the next person, no problem.
Right, but before the age of genetics and an understanding of heritability, people did the same.
Well, they did, but here's the thing, Tane, this is the twist on it all.
Right.
Why, in an age where we're aware of what heritability is and how it works largely, and if Philip Franco himself, pardon me, is well aware of the high probability that his son will have this kidney disorder, why would he reproduce from an ethical or moral standpoint?
Well, I think that's the hope of sexual recombination, that what parts of yourselves you would rather leave behind will, be what's left behind. Only 50% of you will make it into that child, and you just have to hope for the best, or hope to have children so numerous that you wouldn't see the parts of yourself you'd rather leave behind in those. Sexual recombination is a solution to this, technically.
Yeah. I think you're giving him too much credit. I don't even think he knows what sexual recombination is, eh?
Right. I understand that he's in some ways selfish, but I think there's something to be said for a biological desire to replicate yourself. There was an unbroken line of people who passed this disease onto him. He sees value in himself, and so does his partner. That he would I don't think he sees it as the worst possible thing.
Well, his partner sees value in the money he makes. I don't know.
Okay, I see what you're saying. The value is money.
Right.
The value is money, is what you're saying. I mean, it's yeah. I agree with you there. I don't see if it's him paying and no one else is being forced to.
Sure. It's just that I don't think
it's a high probability, but if you're going to make a child or raise one, most people would like it to be theirs.
I totally understand that. There are all obvious reasons for that, but it seems that in this day and age, even when there are good arguments against it, there's certain types of people, including myself, that probably shouldn't be reproducing, and they never really give it any thought. They just do it rather selfishly, and they justify it after the fact. And it's obviously it's a kind of philosophical consideration, and most people breed like lemmings, so it's not really something people give much consideration to. We're kind of moving into the territory of, I guess, antinatalism, but I think that all things in balance, that if I were Philip DeFranco, well, I'm not reproducing myself, but if I were just him and I thought about it, I wouldn't want to pass on that disease to my son, even if it's just a probability rather than a certitude. So, just my thoughts.
But does that desire to not pass it on surpass the desire to have a son at all?
Well, that's the question. I would argue for most people that it's just fucking reproduced. They're not going to really think about the consequences.
Right. And thinking about the consequences evolutionarily would be a very negative thing to do, wouldn't it?
Well, it would be, and it absolutely. The ideal situation is to be a guy like Genghis Khan. You just knock up as many women as possible and let the chips fall where they may, and then you have this amazing genetic legacy. So
I suppose the problem with finding people that don't want to reproduce with like lemmings is that the ones who didn't aren't here.
yeah, that's pretty obvious. That's kind of the dilemma we're facing these days as well, that the more G-loaded people tend to have fewer children on average than the not so G-loaded people. I think that's just a natural compensatory mechanism, because for all sorts of reasons. When you're not that bright, there's less to do. There's less you can do in the world. Some of it's just boredom. You end up just having more sex, probably. That's part of it, I think. Let's give these teen pregnancies in the UK are like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this has been well studied, but I would guess there's probably some correlation between longevity and G-loadedness. And, it might be
if for nothing else other than delay. Sorry. Yeah.
Correct. And so if you're high G-loaded, you're gonna having 5 or even 10 children is less of a consideration than having 2, because you're going to live a longer time. You're going to be able to do more. If you're low G-loaded, then it's a compensatory mechanism. Just have lots of children to sort of counter the discrepancies there. At least that's how I would think of it. And we have political systems that support that sort of thing. So there's an interesting argument people always make that if we didn't have welfare, then this stuff wouldn't happen. I still think that people in the sort of low G-loaded bracket would still have lots of children. Historically, that was always the case. Children were a labor commodity. They were a insurance policy against the infirmities of old age, etc. So I don't really think my own view is that, say, cutting off welfare would not change sort of the mass reproduction of people who aren't that bright, for example. That's my own view.
Yeah, but it might create a cutoff. There might be like a certain amount of useless that you can't be. People like that have to survive in the world, usually, by the grit of their teeth.
Yeah, no, definitely the case. But again, all theoretical. None of this is gonna. For the time being, we live in a society that supports both eugenic and dysgenic things in human beings, and it's viewed as every human being's fundamental right to reproduce, if only because it's just such an instinctual thing. It's interesting. I don't know if I completely agree with that perspective. That we have. That it's ideal to say that it's a fundamental right that we all reproduce. Some people, I think, are just a bit long-term better off reproducing than other people. And
I think most people, if they're honest with themselves, would find that to be the case. But the difficulty comes when you consider the alternatives.
Well, look, you could create a set of good criteria once you have all the science out. And there's nothing. If most people, for example, a lot of pregnancies are a result of accidents. They're not even intentional. That just means people are trying to enjoy things, the carnal pleasure. So, pardon me. What I'm thinking here is that people could still have quote unquote rich, enjoyable lives without some of these byproducts. And the people that were in a better category to reproduce, people like you should ideally reproduce because you're smart and capable and all of these things. There's that. But the rest of us who probably don't warrant that, it's not the end of the world, at least for your life, because there are all these other things to do. All kinds of systems you can come up with, like compensation, things that would not require draconian, cruel measures or anything like that. For example, what if, this is completely hypothetical, what if each person who deemed unfit were also given a kind of life stipend of $100,000 to self-sterilize or something like that? There are ways you could do this without the use of force, and you could even create incentives on these things. And in this sense, going forward, humanity would quite literally only be making use of the best. Now, the counter argument to this I've heard is, we can't predict what's going to be useful or not, and who knows? There'll be traits.
Right.
But
and
we know.
Furthermore, would we want to domesticate ourselves? What you'd essentially be doing there is deciding ahead of time, in an artificial manner, as you would with livestock, what you desire ahead of time, and neglecting the possibilities for what could be.
That's definitely an argument, but I think we can observe a general trend and thrust of where things are going in society, and it's going into the types of jobs that are cognitively demanding, that require a lot of thought. I mean, you wouldn't be a geneticist if you were a small brain nibba, let's be honest. And these are the types of jobs that that we need smart people to do. Now, of course, things, we could get hit by an asteroid and it reverts back to, caveman times, and those types of people would reassert themselves, the people who would thrive in that type of environment. But I do think that obviously there would be some risk to sort of domesticating ourselves, but the risks wouldn't be nearly as great, and it would be a much better use of resources to invest in you and people and your offspring, or other people of comparable capability, than just keeping people on a lifeline just so they can pop out more of their own kind.
I think we can definitely agree that a system which values the reproduction of all people under any circumstances, by whatever means, is obviously a flawed one. And something between what you propose and that is not too unreasonable to ask for.
Yeah. It's just that, you would have to establish criteria. And the problem with criteria is they're always arbitrary. I mean, people can try to make it not the case, but it's always arbitrary. You could, you'd probably set up some minimal IQ, minimal health requirement. It may be under one system, flat feet would be banned from reproduction as a potential, and others it wouldn't be. Myopia, height, all these things, and it would just be arbitrary. And I don't have enough knowledge, and I'm not smart enough to come up with a system that would maybe no one is that would work in the best possible way. Although I'm 95% sure that I should not reproduce myself. I don't need a system to incentivize me to not reproduce, but I definitely think that it's something to consider. Although every trend we have now is going in the opposite direction.
Right.
So that's not good. And ideally something, I don't know, we can get some kind of discussion about this. But then again, what can we, this is a pretty controversial thing in itself to talk about. It invokes all kinds of images and what have you. And I don't think it should. It's just something to consider. Because, as I mentioned in my earlier video about resources, well, at least in part, resources are finite. Food, water, shelter, these are finite resources, but then so is money, so are financial resources, so are laboratories in which you do work, education. Why not funnel those resources to smart people, capable, healthy people, than just sort of trying to even out deficiencies in other people? And again, I would include myself amongst the deficient. I'm just saying that what we're doing now is not good. Despite the possibility that, who knows down the line in terms of evolution, there might be some long-term benefits to allowing all manner of people to reproduce, but I wasn't allowing, say, encouraging them.
Right. But we don't necessarily have to encourage them. Imagine if we had like a more anarchic society and whatever rose to the top just did. You might get similar results.
Yeah, but then, I mean, right, most
Not
people,
as efficient.
Right, and frankly speaking, there's nothing that that having a more anarchic society, I mean, I don't know what that would be, is sort of like a minimalist government system. Who knows? And nobody in their right mind these days is going to endorse that. We have this sort of standard model that is very static, and I would argue moribund, because nobody wants to do anything about it. Nobody's even willing to say, maybe we had this welfare system for 40, 50 years, and results aren't that great. Let's try something new. Anyone arguing that? Nope. Probably everyone knows that it's, defective, or at least inefficient, or hasn't produced the results that it were claimed it would produce long-term down the line. That's definitely the case.
But then what do you do if you've produced all these people using those programs that just won't exist or can't continue to exist without them? You create a huge moral weight that wasn't there for the implementation of that policy for its removal.
Yeah, and I try to be an ethical person. There are certainly ethical considerations here, but we have to balance our ethical considerations with common sense.
A more tremendous weight needs to be put on, like, the imposition of these types of policy when the inevitable consequence is such a horrible cost to take them back away.
Look, whether you believe the planet is overpopulated or not, I mean, eventually it will be. There, again, limited space, right?
Right.
So
what I'm saying, so additional spending in this direction, like where more people are given greater and greater access to that right to breed that we believe kind of permeates our society. There should be a greater premium placed on that kind of thing before it gets through. Like, it shouldn't be as easy as it is, knowing what we do about what it'll cost to get rid of.
I agree, but again,
how are we ever going to do that?
How are we ever going to do that? I don't know. I am inclined to think. That it's not going to happen. Just because, well, at least not in our lifetime. There are very fixed structures in place. Things aren't changing, and the current status quo of far left exclusive politics, that seems to be par for the course and here to stay for a while, at least, a long term. The pushback against it isn't strong enough, and more importantly, the pushback against those type of politics has no power base, really. So, I guess whether it comes to reproduction or really any other issue that appears to be quote unquote controversial, the best policy for a lot of people, including yourself, is just to be the good worker drone, do your job as a geneticist, and never talk about anything about your work or about really anything that could be even perceived remotely to be against the grain.
Yep. It's
good
pretty
times.
Depressing.
Hey, at least you're a fucking good sniper and you can land headshots. There's that.
Yeah. Even better these days.
Yeah, see? That's good. You got to look at the small things in life, like that high KD and multiple headshots lined up. So don't look.
I think I'm up in the top 1% now.
Really? Oh, wow, that's really impressive. So you see, you can focus on the small things, and the big things, they lose their weight, and it all feels a lot better. That was we've talked mostly about the aging. We've covered, I guess, the ethics of reproduction. That was a pretty good discussion. I will try to get on our esteemed Tane Caledon in the future on maybe a related topic, taking advantage of his large repertoire of genetic knowledge, if the topic is falls within that. And I guess I'll thank you for joining me.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.